The wind over the Texas plains carried a strange silence that morning. Anthony Ridley stepped out onto his porch with a steaming mug of coffee, expecting nothing more than the low call of cattle and the rising warmth of an early March sun. But what he saw instead froze him in place. A brand new steel fence stretched across his property line, gleaming, cold, unyielding. At its center, a heavy padlock sealed the only road that led to the county highway and the creek his herd depended on. And stamped across the sign in bold black letters were 5 words that made his stomach twist. Property access managed by Lakeside Meadows HOA. Anthony Ridley didn't put up that fence. It wasn't his. It wasn't even on his land. Yet it cut him off like a prisoner, trapping his cattle, his livelihood, his dream. Now here's where things take a chilling turn. The only key to that lock belonged to one person, Marjorie Kane, the iron-fisted president of the HOA. A woman in sharp suits, sharper heels, and an even sharper reputation for breaking anyone who dared to question her. And in that moment, standing barefoot on the porch of the ranch he had worked decades to build, Anthony realized something unthinkable. He was fenced in, not by wood or wire, but by arrogance, rules, and a lock he didn't own. But what Anthony did next, no one in Lakeside Meadows saw it coming. Not the board, not Marjorie Kane, not even his neighbors, who watched in silence as this quiet rancher prepared to turn the entire community upside down. Stick with me, because this story doesn't just end with a man buying back his freedom. It becomes a full-blown showdown that dragged an entire neighborhood into the fight and exposed just how far one HOA president was willing to go to keep control. Anthony wasn't some outsider without roots. He was 46 years old, calloused hands from years of hard labor, and a back that still ached from his last carving season. He had saved every dollar he could to leave behind the noise and traffic of Amarillo. This ranch outside Abilene was supposed to be his fresh start. Peaceful mornings, the steady rhythm of ranch work, the sound of cattle lowing against the wind. That was his dream. But Marjorie Kane had other plans. By the time Anthony reached the gate that morning, 2 men in HOA polo shirts were tightening bolts into the steel posts. He called out, trying to keep his voice steady, "Morning, fellas. Mind telling me what this is?" One didn't look up. The other muttered, "Talk to the board." And then she arrived. A spotless silver SUV rolled up. Out stepped Marjorie Kane, sunglasses perched high, clipboard under her arm. She didn't greet him. She didn't explain. She just announced, "Mr. Ridley, you've been notified of your non-compliance issues." Anthony frowned. "Non-compliance with what?" "Perimeter fencing must match community standards," she replied briskly. "Yours does not. Until corrected, this measure will prevent further violations." Anthony gestured at the grazing cattle, now penned in like animals in a zoo. "That's my access road. My herd needs water from that creek. And that fence," he pointed, jaw tightening, "isn't even on your land." Her smile was razor thin. "The access easement is controlled by the HOA, Mr. Ridley. It's in the covenant you agreed to when you purchased this property." His heart sank. He remembered that mountain of closing papers, the endless legal jargon no one but a lawyer could truly decipher. Buried in those pages, she had found her weapon. "You mean to tell me," Anthony said slowly, "that you can just lock me in until I comply?" "Exactly." She turned without another word. "Contact our office when you're ready to discuss the approved fencing style." The gate clanged shut. The padlock clicked. And with that, she drove off, leaving Anthony standing there, hands on his hips, the morning wind tugging at his shirt. But here's the twist. Anthony wasn't the kind of man to be broken by a lock. He'd wrestled drought, disease, and debt. And now, staring at that gleaming fence, he made a decision. This wasn't just about cattle. It was about dignity. It was about freedom. And if Marjorie Kane thought she could fence him in, she was about to discover just how wrong she was. Don't go anywhere, because what Anthony did next not only shocked his neighbors, but set the stage for one of the boldest moves any rancher has ever made against an HOA. What if the only road to your land suddenly belonged to someone else, and they had the key to your future? Anthony Ridley sat at his kitchen table that night, the padlock's echo still ringing in his ears. The coffee had gone cold, untouched. Across from him sat Glenn Porter, his neighbor and a retired trucker who had seen plenty of fights in his life. On the road, in union halls, and now against this very HOA. "They've been doing this for years," Glenn said, swirling his mug. "Marjorie's got the board wrapped around her finger. If she doesn't like you, she'll make your life miserable." Anthony shook his head. "I didn't come out here to be pushed around by a committee. This land isn't just property to me, Glenn. It's my dream. It's my future." "Then you'd better be ready for a fight," Glenn warned, "because she sure won't back down. And she won't give you that key unless you play her game." Anthony leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. He'd fought stubborn cattle before, stared down dust storms that blotted out the horizon, and worked double shifts just to keep feed on the table. But this was different. This was a war waged with paper, signatures, and a lock. Still, one thought settled in his chest. He would not bow. 2 days later, Anthony walked into the Lakeside Meadows clubhouse for his first official HOA meeting. The place smelled like stale carpet and lukewarm coffee. Every seat in the small conference room was filled, neighbors sitting stiffly as if afraid to breathe too loud. At the front, 6 board members sat behind a folding table. And in the middle, wearing a navy blazer and a necklace that shimmered like it cost more than his first truck, sat Marjorie Kane. Her gaze followed him as he entered. "Mr. Ridley," she said into the microphone before the meeting even began, "you'll be on the agenda under compliance matters." The first 40 minutes dragged by. Petty arguments over mailbox colors, complaints about pool hours, even a debate over the height of someone's shrubs. Anthony flipped through the packet they'd given him. Page after page of rules dictating paint colors, lawn ornaments, driveway lengths. And then his name was called. He rose, his boots echoing against the floor as he walked to the front. "Let's talk about that fence," Marjorie began. "It's the same fence I've used for years," Anthony said evenly. "Strong enough for cattle. Safe. Functional." "Functional isn't the standard here," she shot back. "Community aesthetics are. Your fence doesn't meet approved specifications." Anthony opened his folder and spread documents across the table. Photos of neighboring properties, letters, and deeds. "This is a cattle ranch, not a golf course. And besides, you're not enforcing your own rules evenly. I passed 3 homes this week alone, each with different fences. None of them match yours, and none of them are locked behind a gate." A murmur rippled through the audience. One board member shifted uncomfortably. "Those cases are under review," Marjorie snapped. "You, however, remain out of compliance. The fines will continue until the fence is corrected." Anthony leaned closer. "And what about the fact you're blocking my herd's access to the creek? You're interfering with their water supply. That's not just wrong, it's dangerous." "You have other water sources," Marjorie replied coldly. "Satellite imagery confirms it." Anthony laughed without humor. "Satellite imagery? You think a photo from space tells you how I run this ranch?" Glenn raised his hand from the second row. "Marjorie, the man's been here 2 months. Maybe cut him some slack before locking him in like a prisoner." But Marjorie didn't flinch. "Standards are standards, Mr. Porter. If Mr. Ridley wants to be part of this community, he must play by the rules." Anthony gathered his folder. "And if I don't?" Her eyes narrowed. "Then we fine you, and if necessary, legal action." He walked back to his seat, his jaw tight, his frustration boiling. Around him, neighbors whispered, some offering quick, hushed words of support, others avoiding eye contact altogether. Fear had them all by the throat, but Anthony wasn't about to choke. That night, the HOA's game became crystal clear. A letter arrived in his mailbox, bold red ink at the top reading, HOA compliance notice. The fines started at $50 a day, then doubled, then tripled. The violation. His fence was a visual inconsistency detrimental to community appeal. Anthony read it aloud in his kitchen, shaking his head. Visual inconsistency? I'm raising cattle, not hosting weddings. Glenn chuckled dryly. They know exactly what they're doing. They pile it on until you either bleed money or fold. But instead of folding, Anthony began documenting everything. Letters, photographs, dates. He built a thick file, evidence he hoped would one day crack the HOA's armor. Still, every day the lock mocked him. Every day the cattle pushed against the fence, bellowing toward the creek they couldn't reach. And every day Marjorie tightened the screws, acting like she was untouchable. But the truth was, Anthony had already started looking for her weak spot. And when he found it, he would pull off a move so bold, so unexpected, it would change the fight forever. What would you do if the key to your future was hanging on someone else's clipboard? Would you play by their rules, or rewrite them? The Texas sun beat down like a hammer, and the dry wind carried dust across Anthony's land. His cattle paced restlessly, sensing something wasn't right. The locked gate wasn't just an inconvenience anymore. It was a threat to his herd. That week, Anthony got another letter. This time, the fines had ballooned to nearly $2,000. And worse, the HOA warned that if he didn't comply, they would place a lien on his property. He sat at the kitchen table, letter in hand, heart pounding. A lien, he muttered, over a fence. Glenn, sitting across from him, shook his head. That's their endgame. They don't just want your money. They want control. Marjorie doesn't care about fences, Anthony. She cares about proving she owns you. Anthony slammed the paper down. No one owns me. The next morning, Anthony did something no one expected. He backed his old Ford tractor out of the shed, the engine rumbling like thunder. Neighbors peeked from their windows, whispering as he drove straight to the locked gate. He climbed down, took one long look at the padlock glinting in the sun, and said under his breath, "Not today." With a roar, he dropped the tractor's bucket and drove it straight into the steel fence. The metal screeched, bolts popping, posts twisting under the force. The padlock shattered against the dirt. Within seconds, the gate that had imprisoned him stood mangled, torn wide open. Anthony killed the engine. For a long moment, silence hung heavy in the air. Then, slowly, his cattle began to push through, making their way to the creek at last. From across the road, Marjorie Kane appeared, SUV screeching to a halt, door slamming. She stormed toward him, her heels stabbing the dirt. "Mr. Ridley," she shouted, "that is HOA property. You've just destroyed community infrastructure." Anthony wiped the sweat from his brow, calm as stone. "That was my road, my herd, my right. You'll pay for this," she hissed. Anthony stepped closer, lowering his voice so only she could hear. "Lady, I've paid in blood, sweat, and years for this land, and I'll be damned if I let a padlock stand between me and my cattle." Neighbors had gathered now, whispering, some even smiling faintly. For the first time, someone had stood up to Marjorie, and she didn't look so invincible. But Anthony knew this wasn't over. In fact, it was only beginning. That night, his phone buzzed with calls from neighbors he'd never even spoken to before. Some thanked him for standing up. Others warned him that Marjorie would come down harder than ever. But one call changed everything. It came from a man named Ray Delgado, an attorney who lived just 3 streets over. "I've been watching what's happening, Anthony," Ray said. "And you're not alone. This HOA has been abusing their power for years. I've got case files thicker than phone books. If you're ready, we can fight this, not with tractors but with the law." Anthony leaned back, a slow smile tugging at his lips. "You tell me where to sign." The next HOA meeting wasn't business as usual. Anthony didn't come alone this time. Ray Delgado walked in beside him, briefcase in hand, eyes sharp as steel. The room hushed. When Marjorie saw them, her smile faltered. "Mr. Ridley," she began, "after your recent destruction of property." Ray cut her off. "Let's get something straight. You've illegally obstructed a landowner's access to water. You've enforced rules selectively, targeting one resident while ignoring others. And you've attempted to levy fines without proper due process." Gasps filled the room. Marjorie shifted in her chair, visibly rattled. Ray snapped his briefcase open and laid down a thick stack of papers. This is evidence of your abuse of power. And if you think you can take this man's land with your liens and your threats, you're about to learn the hard way how the law really works. Anthony crossed his arms, silent, letting the attorney's words hang heavy. For once, Marjorie didn't have a sharp comeback. But here's where the story gets even more shocking. What happened next would drag the entire HOA into a courtroom battle that exposed secrets no one saw coming. What if standing your ground made you the spark that lit an entire neighborhood's rebellion? The courthouse smelled faintly of old wood and coffee, serious, steady, and unshakable. Anthony had never been in one for anything bigger than renewing a license, but now he stood at the center of a storm that was bigger than cattle and fences. It was about power. Ray Delgado, sharp in a dark suit, stood beside him. Across the aisle sat Marjorie Kane and two HOA board members, their lawyer shuffling papers nervously. Case number 2025-047, the judge called. Ridley versus Lakeside Meadows Homeowners Association. Anthony sat down, his boots planted firm on the courtroom floor. He felt eyes on him. Not just Marjorie's cold stare, but half the neighborhood, who had shown up to see if someone could finally knock her off her throne. Ray rose. His voice was steady, deliberate. Your Honor, the HOA has overstepped its authority. They blocked lawful access to water, selectively enforced their own rules, and attempted to coerce Mr. Ridley with escalating fines. We have evidence that this isn't just negligence, it's targeted harassment. He placed photos on the table, driveways with mismatched fences, mailboxes in non-approved colors, lawns with ornaments far more garish than Anthony's cattle fence. Yet none of these homes received fines. Only Mr. Ridley. The judge studied the photos, his brow furrowing. Marjorie's lawyer scrambled to respond. Your Honor, this is about maintaining community standards. Mr. Ridley's fence is incompatible with the agreed design. The lock on the gate was installed to preserve safety, not to restrict his herd. Ray pounced. Safety? Tell me, then why is there no record of a vote authorizing this lock? Why were homeowners not consulted? And why, in the HOA's own financials, is there no invoice for the lock's installation? Almost as if this was done unilaterally by the board president. All eyes turned to Marjorie. For the first time, she looked nervous. Anthony sat forward. Judge, all I ever wanted was to run my ranch. That creek is the only steady water source during the dry months. That padlock wasn't just an inconvenience. It was endangering my cattle. That's my livelihood. That's food on my table. The courtroom went silent. Even the judge leaned back, folding his hands. Mr. Delgado, the judge said slowly, I see more here than just a fence dispute. This appears to be a pattern of abuse. I'm ordering a full review of this HOA's enforcement practices. Until then, all fines against Mr. Ridley are suspended. A murmur swept the room. Neighbors whispered to one another. Some even smiled. Anthony exhaled. It wasn't victory yet, but it was the first crack in Marjorie's armor. After the hearing, people Anthony had never spoken to before approached him in the parking lot. You did good in there, one man said. You're braver than the rest of us, whispered a woman. Another neighbor added, maybe it's time someone finally ran against Marjorie. Anthony realized then it wasn't just his fight anymore. He had become the voice for everyone who'd been steamrolled by the HOA. And deep down, he knew, if he wanted lasting change, he couldn't just win in court. He'd have to take the battle straight to the board itself. Which meant going head-to-head with Marjorie Kane in an election that would shake the community to its core. What happens when the person who never wanted power is forced to take it, just to protect his way of life? The HOA clubhouse had never been this full. Folding chairs lined the walls, neighbors packed shoulder to shoulder, and the air was heavy with whispers. Tonight wasn't just another meeting, it was the election for HOA president. For years, Marjorie Kane had run unopposed. Her word was law, her rules unquestioned. But this time, things were different. Anthony Ridley had put his name on the ballot. When the announcement first spread, people laughed. A rancher? Running the HOA? But after the court case, after the fence, after the way he stood up while everyone else stayed quiet, those laughs turned into murmurs of hope. Now, under the buzzing fluorescent lights, Anthony sat in the front row, wearing a clean shirt but still in his boots, hat resting on his knee. He didn't look like a politician. He looked like a man who'd had enough. Marjorie took the floor first. Her speech was polished, rehearsed. Neighbors, we all know why we're here. I've dedicated years to keeping Lakeside Meadows a safe, beautiful community. I've enforced the rules fairly and consistently because without order we have chaos. Do you really want someone with no experience running things? Polite applause followed, but it was thin, weaker than years before. Then it was Anthony's turn. He stood slowly, adjusting his hat before setting it down. His voice was low, steady, unpolished but real. I'm not here to make speeches. I'm not here to sit in meetings all day. I'm here because I got tired of being pushed around. And I reckon a lot of you are tired of it too. He paused, scanning the crowd. Neighbors leaned forward, listening. Rules are fine. Order is fine. But when rules become weapons, when they're used to keep one man down and another man up, that's not a community. That's a kingdom. And last I checked, we didn't elect a queen. The room erupted in laughter and claps. Marjorie's face flushed red. Anthony nodded, finishing, all I want is simple, fairness. No one above the rules, no one beneath them, and no padlocks keeping us from what's rightfully ours. The applause this time was thunderous. Ballots were passed out, pens scratched. The votes were counted in tense silence. When the final numbers were read, the room gasped. Anthony had won. By a landslide. Marjorie sat frozen, her perfect smile cracking, while neighbors swarmed Anthony, shaking his hand, clapping his back, thanking him. For the first time, the HOA had a leader who wasn't there for power but for principle. But as Anthony walked outside under the Texas night sky, he knew one thing for sure. This fight might be won, but the war for fairness was far from over. Because when power slips away from those who crave it most, they don't go quietly. What happens when victory only opens the door to a new battle? For a few weeks, Lakeside Meadows felt different. Neighbors walked lighter, smiling more, relieved that the chokehold of Marjorie's HOA reign had finally been broken. Anthony chaired meetings with fairness, listening more than he spoke. The rancher had become the unlikely leader, but power never dies quietly. Late one evening, Ray Delgado called. Anthony, you'd better see this. The next morning, a thick envelope landed in Anthony's mailbox. Inside, legal documents. Marjorie Kane had filed a civil lawsuit against him personally, claiming defamation and damages from his campaign speech. She wasn't fighting for the HOA anymore. She was fighting for revenge. Anthony stared at the papers, his jaw tightening. He thought the election was the end of it. But this was her last card. The case drew even more attention than the election. Local news vans parked outside the courthouse, cameras catching every glare and whisper. To the media, it was David versus Goliath, a rancher standing against the iron grip of a suburban tyrant. Inside, Ray tore her arguments apart piece by piece. She claims defamation, yet the defense is simple truth. Truth isn't defamation, Your Honor. Anthony rose for the final word. I didn't run for president to tear anyone down. I ran because I believe no one person should hold all the power. I told the truth, and the truth shouldn't cost a man his life savings. The courtroom went quiet. The judge finally spoke. Case dismissed. With prejudice. Anthony exhaled. Marjorie's last weapon had been stripped away. As Anthony walked out into the sunlight, neighbors gathered around, cheering, clapping, even hugging him. Reporters shouted questions, but he only gave one simple answer. I'm not a politician. I'm just a man who wanted to keep his cattle watered. But sometimes standing up for the small things, that's how you end up changing everything. Marjorie was never seen at another HOA meeting again. Anthony never asked to be a leader, but life has a way of dragging ordinary men into extraordinary fights. What started as a locked gate and a thirsty herd of cattle became a battle over fairness, power, and principle. He didn't win because he was cleverer than Marjorie. He didn't win because he had more money or sharper suits. He won because he stood firm when everyone else bent. And that's the truth of it. Power only lasts as long as people are too afraid to challenge it. In the end, Anthony taught his neighbors, and maybe all of us, that sometimes the bravest thing you can do isn't to seek power, but to refuse to be broken by it. Because real strength doesn't come from controlling others. It comes from standing tall, even when the weight of the world leans against you.